My name is Amanda Williams. I'm 19 years old, and the day police handcuffed my father while my mother sobbed uncontrollably was the day 3 years of secret evidence finally vindicated everything I'd been trying to tell her. You're exaggerating, Amanda. Your father would never hurt you like that, she'd said for years, dismissing my pleas for help. But when Detective Morrison showed her the hidden cameras, audio recordings, and medical documentation I'd been collecting, Mom collapsed against the kitchen counter whispering, "Oh my God, what have I done to my daughter?" Before we dive into this story of family denial, hidden abuse, and the evidence that changed everything, I want to know, what would you do if your own mother refused to believe you were being abused by the person she loved? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to hit that like button and subscribe because this journey from victim to survivor gets absolutely incredible. The moment my mother finally saw the truth about my father will leave you speechless, and what I did next changed our family forever. Growing up, the Williams family looked picture perfect from the outside. Dad, Michael Williams, was a respected high school principal who was beloved by students, parents, and colleagues. Mom, Susan Williams, was a devoted wife and part-time real estate agent who organized charity events and baked cookies for school fundraisers. And I was their honor roll daughter who played violin and volunteered at the local animal shelter. But behind our white picket fence and manicured lawn, a very different reality existed. My father was a master manipulator who presented one face to the world and another to his family. The charming, patient educator that everyone admired was actually a controlling, violent man who ruled our household through fear and intimidation. The abuse started when I was 14, shortly after I began developing physically and showing signs of independence that threatened Dad's absolute control over our family. It began with verbal attacks disguised as constructive criticism and tough love that was supposedly meant to help me become a better person. "Amanda, you're getting fat. No man will ever want you if you don't learn self-control," he'd say while I was eating dinner, causing me to push food around my plate instead of eating. "Your violin playing is mediocre at best. If you're not going to practice properly, maybe we should sell the instrument and save the money." But the psychological abuse quickly escalated to physical violence. Dad would grab my arm hard enough to leave bruises when I didn't respond to his commands quickly enough. He'd slap me across the face for talking back when I tried to defend myself. He'd push me against walls and hold me there while screaming about my failures and inadequacies. The worst part was how he'd immediately switch back to loving father mode after each incident. "Daddy's sorry, sweetheart," he'd say, stroking my hair while I cried. "You know I only get upset because I love you so much. I just want you to be the best version of yourself." This cycle of abuse followed by affection was designed to keep me confused and compliant. Dad would explain that his anger was my fault. I'd provoked him by being disrespectful, lazy, or ungrateful. He'd convince me that normal fathers discipline their daughters when they misbehaved, and that I was lucky to have someone who cared enough to correct my flaws. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the abuse was my mother's complete denial of what was happening right in front of her. Mom had built her entire identity around being married to a wonderful man and having a perfect family. Acknowledging Dad's abuse would have shattered her worldview and forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her marriage and her failure to protect her daughter. So instead, Mom chose willful blindness. When I tried to tell her about Dad's violence, she dismissed my complaints as teenage drama or exaggeration for attention. When she saw bruises on my arms, she'd accept Dad's explanations about me being clumsy or roughhousing with friends. When I begged her to intervene during his verbal attacks, she'd tell me to stop provoking your father and learn to be more respectful. "Your father works very hard to provide for this family," Mom would say whenever I complained about his treatment. "The least you can do is show him some appreciation instead of causing problems with your attitude." Mom's gaslighting was almost worse than Dad's abuse because it came from the person who was supposed to protect me unconditionally. Every time she dismissed my pain or made excuses for Dad's behavior, she reinforced his narrative that I was the problem in our family dynamic. The isolation was crushing. I couldn't tell friends about the abuse because Dad was their beloved principal, and no one would believe that such a respected community leader was hurting his daughter. I couldn't tell teachers because they all worked for Dad and saw him as a mentor and friend. I couldn't tell extended family because Mom had convinced them that I was a difficult teenager, going through a rebellious phase. So I suffered in silence, walking on eggshells in my own home and developing anxiety, depression, and a deep mistrust of my own perceptions. Dad convinced me that I was oversensitive, ungrateful, and mentally unstable. Mom convinced me that my experiences weren't real or weren't serious enough to matter. But as the abuse escalated during my junior and senior years of high school, I realized that my survival depended on finding a way to prove what was happening to me. If no one would believe my word against Dad's reputation, then I needed evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That's when I started secretly documenting everything, beginning a 3-year investigation that would ultimately destroy Dad's carefully constructed image and force Mom to confront the truth she'd been denying for years. The decision to gather evidence wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about protecting future victims. Dad's pattern of psychological manipulation and physical violence wasn't going to stop with me. If I didn't expose him, he'd continue hurting people while maintaining his respectable facade. But collecting evidence of abuse while living with your abuser is incredibly dangerous. I had to be smarter, more careful, and more strategic than a traumatized teenager should ever have to be. One mistake could have resulted in escalated violence or even death. The evidence I gathered over the next 3 years would eventually fill multiple police file boxes and provide prosecutors with everything they needed to ensure Dad faced serious consequences for his crimes. But the journey from victim to survivor was the most terrifying and empowering experience of my life. The summer before my senior year of high school, I made the decision that would ultimately save my life and expose my father's true nature. I was going to document everything. Every incident of abuse, every threat, every moment when Dad's mask slipped and revealed the monster underneath his respectable exterior. But gathering evidence against an abuser while living in their house required careful planning and extreme caution. Dad was intelligent, paranoid about his reputation, and hyper-aware of any potential threats to his control. If he discovered my documentation efforts, the consequences could have been deadly. I started with a secret journal hidden in a hollowed-out book in my bedroom. Every night after Dad went to sleep, I'd write detailed accounts of that day's incidents, what he said, what he did, how Mom reacted, and the physical and emotional impact on me. I documented patterns in his behavior, triggers that set off his rage, and the escalating severity of his attacks. June 15th, Dad grabbed my wrist and twisted it because I didn't set the dinner table exactly the way he wanted. Left bruises in the shape of his fingers. When I showed Mom, she said I must have bumped into something and forgotten about it. Dad smiled while she said this. June 22nd, Dad screamed at me for 30 minutes about my lazy attitude because I didn't vacuum the living room carpet in the exact pattern he preferred. Called me worthless and a disappointment, while Mom listened from the kitchen and said nothing. When I started crying, he said crying was manipulative behavior and slapped me across the face. The written documentation was important, but I knew I needed more concrete evidence that couldn't be dismissed as fabricated or exaggerated. So I began secretly recording Dad's verbal abuse using my phone, hiding it in my pocket or backpack during his tirades. The first recording I captured was Dad screaming at me about my college application essays. His voice was filled with hatred and contempt as he called me stupid, worthless, and an embarrassment to the family. He threatened to beat some sense into me if I didn't start showing him proper respect. When I played the recording back later, I was shocked by how violent and unhinged Dad sounded. This wasn't the calm, measured voice of the respected educator everyone knew. This was a man completely consumed by rage and control issues. But audio recordings could still potentially be explained away as taken out of context or during moments of unusual stress. I needed visual evidence that would be undeniable and impossible to rationalize. That's when I made the difficult decision to install hidden cameras in our house. Using money I'd saved from part-time jobs and birthday gifts, I purchased small, wireless cameras that could be concealed in everyday objects. I hid cameras in picture frames, alarm clocks, and decorative items positioned throughout our common areas. The cameras were motion-activated and stored footage on cloud servers that Dad couldn't access or delete. The technical setup was challenging for a teenager with no professional surveillance experience, but I researched online tutorials and tech forums until I understood how to create a hidden camera network that would capture Dad's abuse without being detected. The first video evidence I captured was Dad violently shaking me while screaming about my ungrateful attitude toward his sacrifices for our family. The footage clearly showed his hands on my body, my terrified expression, and Mom in the background choosing to ignore what was happening right in front of her. But the most damaging evidence came from capturing Dad's private conversations with Mom about me. The hidden cameras recorded him strategizing about how to break my spirit and teach me my place in this family. They captured him laughing about my emotional breakdowns and discussing ways to isolate me further from potential sources of support. "She's getting too confident," Dad said to Mom in one recorded conversation. "We need to remind her that everything she has depends on my approval. Maybe it's time to take away some privileges and show her what happens when she doesn't appreciate what I provide." These recordings revealed that Dad's abuse wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was calculated and strategic. He viewed me not as his daughter to be loved and protected, but as a possession to be controlled and dominated. I also began documenting the physical evidence of Dad's violence. I took photos of every bruise, scratch, and mark he left on my body, making sure to include timestamps and detailed descriptions of how each injury occurred. I kept a medical journal tracking the physical and psychological symptoms of the abuse: sleep disturbances, anxiety attacks, eating disorders, and academic performance changes. When Dad's violence resulted in injuries that required medical attention, I made sure to get documentation from healthcare providers. I told doctors and nurses the truth about how my injuries occurred, and I requested that their notes reflect my statements about domestic violence. Several medical professionals expressed concern and offered resources, but I wasn't ready to report Dad officially until I had enough evidence to ensure he couldn't escape consequences. The evidence collection process was emotionally devastating. Watching myself being abused on hidden camera footage was traumatizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Hearing Dad's voice filled with hatred and contempt was almost worse than experiencing the abuse firsthand. And seeing Mom's consistent failure to protect me was heartbreaking every single time. But I forced myself to continue documenting because I knew this evidence would eventually be my path to freedom and justice. Every recording, every photograph, every written account was building a case that would be impossible for Dad to deny or explain away. I also began researching Dad's professional life to see if his abusive behavior extended beyond our household. I discovered that several students and colleagues had made informal complaints about his aggressive management style and inappropriate behavior, but nothing had ever been officially documented or investigated. By creating detailed timelines of Dad's abuse alongside his professional activities, I began to see patterns that suggested his violent tendencies weren't limited to family relationships. This broader pattern of controlling and aggressive behavior would eventually become crucial evidence in building the criminal case against him. As my senior year progressed and college acceptance letters arrived, Dad's abuse intensified. He was losing control over me as I prepared to leave home, and his desperation to maintain dominance led to increasingly dangerous incidents. That's when I realized that I couldn't wait until college to expose Dad's crimes. His violence was escalating to levels that threatened my physical safety, and I had enough evidence to ensure he faced serious legal consequences. It was time to contact law enforcement and let 3 years of secret documentation destroy the perfect family facade once and for all. By the spring of my senior year, Dad's abuse had reached terrifying new levels of violence and psychological torment. My approaching graduation and college enrollment seemed to trigger something primal in him, a desperate need to assert complete control before I gained any independence. The incidents were becoming more frequent and more severe. What had once been occasional slaps and verbal attacks now included choking, throwing objects at me, and threats of sexual violence that crossed lines I never imagined he would cross. "You think you're going to college to escape me?" Dad screamed during one particularly violent episode that my hidden cameras captured in horrifying detail. "You're nothing without me." No one will ever care about you the way I do. You'll come crawling back begging for my forgiveness." He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the kitchen wall while Mom stood just 15 feet away, loading the dishwasher and pretending nothing was happening. The footage showed me gasping for air while clawing at Dad's hands, my face turning red from lack of oxygen, while Mom continued her household tasks as if domestic violence was just background noise. When Dad finally released me and I collapsed to the floor coughing and crying, Mom looked over with mild irritation and said, "Amanda, stop being so dramatic. Your father is just trying to have a conversation with you." Her gaslighting had become so extreme that she could witness attempted strangulation and dismiss it as normal family communication. Mom's psychological investment in denying the abuse had reached delusional levels that endangered my life. But it was the incident 3 weeks before graduation that convinced me I couldn't wait any longer to involve law enforcement. Dad had discovered some college brochures in my room and flew into a rage that lasted for hours, involving multiple forms of physical assault that left me with injuries I couldn't hide. "You think you're better than this family?" he shouted while throwing my laptop against the wall, destroying months of schoolwork and college application materials. "You think some fancy university is going to care about a worthless little girl who can't even respect her own father?" Dad grabbed my hair and dragged me through the house while screaming about my ungrateful attitude and selfish behavior. He threw me down the basement stairs, causing me to hit my head on the concrete floor and lose consciousness briefly. When I came to, Dad was standing over me threatening to finish what I started if I ever disrespected him again. The hidden camera in the basement captured everything: the hair pulling, the violent throwing, my body hitting the stairs, and Dad's threats while I lay injured on the floor. But most importantly, it captured Mom coming downstairs to check on the noise and walking past my bleeding, unconscious body to ask Dad if he wanted her to start dinner. Mom looked directly at me lying motionless on the basement floor with blood pooling under my head, and her only concern was whether Dad was ready to eat. She stepped over my body like I was a piece of furniture that had fallen over, showing no maternal instinct or human compassion whatsoever. That night, I realized that Mom wasn't just enabling Dad's abuse through denial. She was actively participating in it through her complete dehumanization of me. In her mind, I'd stopped being her daughter and had become an obstacle to her perfect marriage fantasy. I spent that night in the emergency room with a concussion, telling doctors that I'd fallen down the stairs, while Dad charmed the medical staff with his concerned father act. He held my hand and spoke in worried tones about how clumsy I was and how he'd been telling me to be more careful for years. "She's always been accident-prone," Dad told the attending physician with a sad smile. "We've been trying to get her to slow down and pay attention, but you know how teenage girls are. They think they're invincible." The doctor looked skeptical about my accident story, but without evidence or my willingness to contradict Dad's narrative, there was nothing he could do except treat my injuries and recommend follow-up care. But I was secretly recording the entire emergency room visit on my phone, capturing Dad's performance and documenting the medical evidence of his violence. The hospital records would become crucial evidence showing the escalating severity of his attacks and the sophisticated lies he told to cover up his crimes. After the basement incident, I made the decision to contact law enforcement. I had 3 years of documentation showing a clear pattern of escalating abuse, including video evidence of attempted strangulation and assault causing serious bodily injury. I had medical records, photographs, audio recordings, and written documentation that painted an undeniable picture of systematic domestic violence. But I also knew that Dad would try to destroy evidence and manipulate the investigation if he suspected what was coming. I needed to coordinate with police to ensure all evidence was preserved and that Dad couldn't harm me further while the case was being built. Detective Sarah Morrison of the Domestic Violence Unit listened to my story with the professionalism and compassion I'd been desperately needing for years. She reviewed the initial evidence I shared and immediately understood the scope and severity of what I documented. "Amanda, what you've collected here is the most comprehensive domestic violence evidence file I've ever seen," Detective Morrison told me during our first meeting. "Your father is not going to be able to deny or explain away this level of documentation." Detective Morrison explained the process for building a criminal case against Dad while ensuring my safety during the investigation. We discussed protective custody options, evidence preservation protocols, and the timeline for arrest and prosecution. But first, Detective Morrison wanted to review all of my evidence and coordinate with the district attorney's office to determine what charges Dad would face. The video evidence of attempted strangulation alone was a felony that carried significant prison time, and the pattern of abuse I'd documented suggested he could be charged under domestic violence statutes that enhanced penalties for repeat offenders. "We're going to need to move carefully," Detective Morrison explained. "Your father is a public figure with a reputation to protect, which means he'll have resources to fight these charges. But the evidence you've collected is so strong that I'm confident we can build a case that will result in serious consequences." We scheduled the arrest for a time when I would be safely away from the house, staying with my aunt who lived in another state. Detective Morrison would execute the arrest warrant while Dad was at work, minimizing the risk of violence or evidence destruction. But there was one thing I hadn't anticipated: Mom's reaction when she learned the truth about what I'd been documenting for 3 years. The morning of Dad's arrest, I was 200 miles away staying with my Aunt Carol, who had driven through the night to get me after Detective Morrison called to coordinate my safety. I'd left home the previous evening under the pretense of visiting colleges, carrying a suitcase that contained my most important possessions and all the backup evidence I'd accumulated over 3 years. Detective Morrison had assembled a team that included domestic violence specialists, digital forensics experts, and child protective services coordinators. The arrest would be executed with precision to ensure Dad couldn't destroy evidence or harm anyone during the process. At exactly 9:15 a.m., while Dad was in his office conducting a faculty meeting, Detective Morrison and 3 other officers arrived at Roosevelt High School with arrest warrants for multiple felony charges including aggravated assault, domestic violence, child abuse, and making criminal threats. I wasn't there to witness Dad's arrest, but Detective Morrison later told me that he tried to maintain his charming, respected educator persona, even while being handcuffed in front of his colleagues. "There's been some misunderstanding," Dad told the officers calmly. "My daughter has been having some mental health issues lately, and I think she may have fabricated some stories for attention. I'm sure we can clear this up quickly." But Detective Morrison had come prepared with preliminary evidence that made Dad's denials impossible to maintain. "Mr. Williams, we have video footage of you strangling your daughter and threatening her life. We have audio recordings of you planning psychological torture. We have medical records documenting injuries you inflicted. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of serious criminal behavior." Dad's composed facade cracked when he realized the scope of evidence against him. "That's impossible," he said, his voice losing its controlled tone. "Amanda she doesn't have access to. How could she? Your daughter is much more intelligent and resourceful than you gave her credit for," Detective Morrison replied. "She's been documenting your crimes for 3 years, and she has enough evidence to ensure you face serious consequences for what you've done to her." Meanwhile, a second team of officers was executing a search warrant at our house, where Mom was having the worst day of her life. She answered the door expecting to sign for a package, and instead found law enforcement officers with documentation authorizing them to search our home for evidence of domestic violence. "There must be some mistake," Mom told the officers. "We're a respectable family. My husband is a high school principal, and we don't have any criminal activity in our household." But when Detective Morrison arrived at the house with Dad's arrest warrant and began explaining the charges, Mom's world started crumbling in real time. "Mrs. Williams, your daughter has provided us with extensive evidence of domestic violence occurring in this home," Detective Morrison explained. "We have video footage, audio recordings, medical documentation, and witness testimony showing that your husband has been physically and psychologically abusing Amanda for several years." Mom's first reaction was the same denial and gaslighting she'd been using for years. "Amanda exaggerates everything. She's always been dramatic and attention-seeking. Whatever she told you, it's not as serious as she made it sound." That's when Detective Morrison made the decision that would shatter Mom's delusions forever. She pulled out a tablet and began showing Mom some of the video evidence I'd collected. The first video was Dad choking me against the kitchen wall while Mom loaded the dishwasher in the background. Mom watched herself ignoring her daughter being strangled just 15 feet away, her face growing pale as she saw her own willful blindness documented in horrifying detail. "Oh my God," Mom whispered, sinking onto the living room couch. "I remember this day. I convinced myself that." Detective Morrison showed her more footage. Dad throwing me down the basement stairs. Dad screaming threats while hitting me with objects. Dad discussing with Mom how to break my spirit more effectively. Each video destroyed another layer of Mom's psychological defenses and forced her to confront what she'd been enabling for years. But it was the audio recording of their private conversation about my college plans that completely broke Mom's denial. She heard herself agreeing with Dad that I needed to be brought down a few pegs, and that maybe a serious consequence would teach me to appreciate what I had at home. "I said that," Mom sobbed, covering her face with her hands. "Oh God, I actually said those things about my own daughter." Detective Morrison continued presenting evidence while other officers photographed and collected physical evidence throughout the house. They found the hidden cameras I'd installed, which Mom had been completely unaware of despite living in the house for months, while they recorded her husband's crimes. "Your daughter has been living in fear while documenting evidence to protect herself," Detective Morrison explained. "She's been begging you for help for years, and instead of protecting her, you've been helping your husband abuse her." The psychological impact on Mom was devastating. 3 years of willful blindness and active enabling came crashing down as she was forced to confront video evidence of her own failure as a mother. She saw herself dismissing my injuries, making excuses for Dad's violence, and participating in psychological abuse that could have driven me to suicide. "Where is Amanda?" Mom asked through her tears. "Is she safe? Does she hate me?" "Amanda is in protective custody and she's safe," Detective Morrison replied. "As for whether she hates you, that's something you'll need to work out with her when she's ready. But first, you need to understand that you enabled years of serious criminal behavior, and there may be legal consequences for your actions as well." That's when Mom learned that her failure to report known child abuse could potentially result in criminal charges against her too. Her enabling behavior had crossed the line from denial into criminal negligence, and the district attorney's office was reviewing whether she should face prosecution alongside Dad. As news of Dad's arrest spread through our community, the response was exactly what I'd expected. Students, parents, and colleagues expressed shock and disbelief that such a respected educator could be capable of domestic violence. Many people initially assumed the charges were false or exaggerated. But Detective Morrison had prepared for this reaction by coordinating with the district attorney's office to release selective evidence that would demonstrate the seriousness and credibility of the charges. Video clips showing Dad's violent behavior were shared with media outlets, along with statements from medical professionals who'd treated my injuries. The evidence was so overwhelming and disturbing that public opinion shifted rapidly from defending Dad to demanding accountability. Parents began questioning whether he'd been abusive toward students, colleagues started reporting incidents they'd previously dismissed, and the school district immediately placed him on administrative leave, pending the criminal investigation. What do you think happened when Dad realized I'd been secretly recording him for 3 years? And how do you think Mom reacted when she saw undeniable proof of her own failure to protect me? Drop your predictions in the comments, because the next part reveals exactly how our family fell apart and rebuilt itself around truth instead of lies. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the courtroom confrontation between me and Dad will leave you speechless. Within 48 hours of Dad's arrest, our small town was in complete upheaval. The news that Michael Williams, the beloved high school principal who'd been nominated for state education awards, was facing multiple felony charges for child abuse sent shockwaves through every family in our community. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Respected Principal Charged with Domestic Violence," accompanied by Dad's professional headshot alongside his mugshot from the county jail. The contrast was jarring. The smiling, confident educator versus the hollow-eyed man who'd been exposed as a violent criminal. But what made the story truly explosive was Detective Morrison's decision to release select portions of my evidence to demonstrate the credibility and severity of the charges. The newspaper published transcripts of audio recordings where Dad could be heard threatening to beat sense into me and calling me worthless and an embarrassment to the family. Local television stations picked up the story within hours, broadcasting excerpts from my hidden camera footage that showed Dad's violent outbursts and Mom's enabling behavior. The video of Dad choking me while Mom ignored the assault just feet away became the most shared content in our town's social media history. The community reaction was swift and devastating for Dad's reputation. Parents who'd trusted him with their children's education were horrified to see evidence of his violent, controlling personality. Students who'd looked up to him as a mentor felt betrayed and confused about how they'd misjudged his character so completely. "I can't believe I sent my daughter to school every day to be supervised by a man who was abusing his own child at home," said Patricia Rodriguez, a parent who'd served on the school board with Dad. "How many warning signs did we miss? How many other children might he have hurt?" The school district immediately launched an internal investigation into Dad's conduct with students and staff. Within days, multiple complaints emerged from people who'd previously been too intimidated to report his aggressive behavior. Jennifer Chun, a former student teacher, came forward with testimony about Dad's inappropriate anger and controlling behavior in professional settings. He would scream at staff members for minor mistakes and humiliate teachers in front of students, she told investigators. "I thought it was just a high-stress job, but now I realize he was abusing his authority the same way he was abusing his family." Several current and former students reported incidents where Dad had grabbed them inappropriately, screamed at them in ways that went far beyond normal disciplinary actions, and made threatening comments about their futures if they didn't comply with his demands. The evidence I'd collected became the foundation for multiple investigations beyond the criminal charges Dad was facing. The state education department opened an inquiry into his professional conduct, the school district launched their own internal review, and several families began considering civil lawsuits for the trauma their children had experienced under his supervision. But the person most devastated by the evidence was Mom, who was forced to confront not just Dad's crimes, but her own role in enabling them. Detective Morrison continued working with Mom to understand the full scope of the abuse and her knowledge of Dad's behavior. "Mrs. Williams, we need you to help us understand how this pattern of abuse was able to continue for so long without intervention," Detective Morrison said during one of their interviews. "Your daughter was clearly in danger, yet you consistently dismissed her reports and made excuses for your husband's violence." Mom struggled to explain her own behavior without sounding like a terrible mother. I convinced myself that Amanda was being overly sensitive. Michael was so respected at work, so admired by everyone. I couldn't reconcile the man everyone loved with the idea that he was hurting our daughter." "But you witnessed the abuse directly," Detective Morrison pressed. "You saw bruises, you heard threats, you were present during violent incidents. How did you rationalize what you were seeing?" "I don't know," Mom sobbed. "I think I was so invested in our family image, so afraid of losing the life we'd built, that I chose to believe his explanations instead of protecting my daughter. I failed her in the worst possible way." Detective Morrison was building a case, not just against Dad, but potentially against Mom as well. Her failure to report known child abuse, her active participation in gaslighting me, and her enabling of Dad's escalating violence could result in criminal charges for child endangerment and accessory to assault. "Your daughter could have been killed, Mrs. Williams," Detective Morrison said bluntly. "The video evidence shows your husband strangling her, throwing her downstairs, and making threats of sexual violence. You witnessed these crimes and chose to help cover them up. That makes you complicit in very serious felonies." The possibility of facing criminal charges herself forced Mom to confront the full reality of what she'd done. She'd spent years protecting her abuser while sacrificing her child's safety, and now she was facing the legal consequences of those choices. Meanwhile, I was working with prosecutors to prepare for Dad's trial while trying to process the community's reaction to our family's exposure. The support from strangers was overwhelming and healing. Hundreds of people reached out with messages of encouragement. offers of help, and their own stories of surviving family abuse. But I also faced criticism from people who believed I should have handled the situation privately rather than involving law enforcement. Some community members accused me of destroying a good man's reputation and tearing apart a respectable family for what they viewed as normal disciplinary actions. Amanda Williams has ruined the life of a dedicated educator over typical parent-child conflicts, wrote one anonymous letter to the newspaper. This is what happens when children are raised to believe they don't have to respect authority or accept consequences for their behavior. These responses showed me how deeply entrenched victim-blaming attitudes were in our community and how many people were more concerned with protecting Dad's reputation than acknowledging the serious crimes he'd committed against a child. But for every person who criticized my decision to expose Dad's abuse, there were dozens who praised my courage and resilience. The evidence I'd collected became a template for other abuse victims who were inspired to document their own situations and seek help. The domestic violence advocacy organizations that worked with Detective Morrison on my case asked me to speak at conferences and training sessions about evidence collection and the importance of believing survivors. My hidden camera footage became part of law enforcement training programs about recognizing and investigating family violence. Most importantly, the investigation revealed that Dad's abusive behavior had extended far beyond our household. The criminal charges he was facing included not just domestic violence against me, but assault charges related to his treatment of students and staff at school. As the evidence mounted and the community learned the truth about Dad's character, his lawyers began discussing plea bargain options to avoid a trial that would expose even more damaging information. But I wasn't interested in bargains or reduced sentences. I wanted Dad to face the full consequences of his choices and to ensure he never had the opportunity to abuse anyone else. The trial would be my opportunity to speak my truth publicly and to show other abuse victims that justice was possible even against powerful, respected perpetrators. 6 months after Dad's arrest, the criminal case had grown far beyond what Detective Morrison initially anticipated. What began as domestic violence charges against one abusive father had expanded into a comprehensive investigation of institutional abuse, criminal conspiracy, and systemic failures that had allowed Dad's crimes to continue for years. The district attorney's office, led by prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, had built what she called the most comprehensive abuse case in the county's history. Dad was facing 14 felony charges including aggravated assault, domestic violence, child abuse, making criminal threats, official misconduct, and sexual assault related to incidents with students that had come to light during the investigation. But the case that generated the most public attention was the charges against Mom for child endangerment and accessory to assault. Her enabling behavior had crossed the line from passive denial into active participation in criminal activity, and prosecutors believed she needed to face consequences for her role in allowing the abuse to continue. Susan Williams knew her husband was committing violent crimes against their daughter and chose to help cover up those crimes rather than protect a child, Prosecutor Walsh explained during a press conference. Her actions enabled escalating abuse that could have resulted in serious injury or death. Mom had initially hired her own attorney and planned to fight the charges, maintaining that she was also a victim of Dad's manipulation and control. But as more evidence emerged showing her active participation in gaslighting me and planning psychological abuse, her legal position became increasingly untenable. The breaking point came when prosecutors released a recorded conversation between Mom and Dad where they discussed strategies for breaking my spirit and ensuring I wouldn't have the confidence to report their abuse to authorities. "Amanda is getting too independent," Mom's voice could be heard saying on the recording. "She needs to remember that everything she has depends on our approval. Maybe we should take away some privileges and remind her how good she has it here." "I've been thinking the same thing," Dad replied. "A little consequences might teach her some gratitude. She's forgotten that I can make her life very difficult if she doesn't show proper respect." This recording destroyed any claim that Mom was an unknowing victim of Dad's abuse. She was clearly a willing participant in planning psychological torture designed to maintain control over me and prevent me from seeking help. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her complicity, Mom's attorney advised her to accept a plea bargain that would result in probation and mandatory counseling rather than risk a trial that could result in prison time. Mrs. Williams needs to acknowledge her role in enabling serious crimes against a child, her attorney explained during plea negotiations. The evidence against her is substantial, and taking responsibility now is her best chance for avoiding prison time. As part of her plea agreement, Mom would have to testify against Dad and provide detailed information about his abusive behavior and their joint efforts to cover it up. She would also be required to attend domestic violence education programs and undergo psychological evaluation to understand how she'd become complicit in child abuse. The hardest part for me was deciding whether to have any contact with Mom during this process. She'd written me dozens of letters from jail expressing remorse and begging for forgiveness, but I wasn't ready to face the person who'd failed to protect me for so many years. Detective Morrison suggested that I might benefit from a supervised conversation with Mom before the trial, both for my own emotional healing and to help prosecutors understand the family dynamics that had enabled Dad's crimes. "Your mother is completely broken," Detective Morrison told me. "Seeing the evidence of what she enabled has destroyed her sense of identity as a good person and loving mother. She's not the same woman who dismissed your injuries and made excuses for your father's violence." But I needed to focus on my own testimony and preparation for confronting Dad in court. The trial was scheduled to last 3 weeks, and I would be the primary witness for the prosecution. My 3 years of documented evidence would be presented in detail, including video footage that would be shown to the jury and made part of the public record. Working with Prosecutor Walsh, I prepared to tell my story in a way that would be clear, compelling, and legally effective. We reviewed every piece of evidence, practiced my testimony, and discussed strategies for maintaining my composure while facing Dad's inevitable attempts to intimidate me from the defense table. "Amanda, what you've accomplished is extraordinary," Prosecutor Walsh told me during one of our preparation sessions. "You survived years of abuse, while secretly building a case that will ensure your father faces serious consequences. You've shown courage and intelligence that many adult professionals couldn't match." But Prosecutor Walsh also prepared me for the reality that Dad's defense team would try to attack my credibility and portray me as a vindictive teenager who'd fabricated evidence to hurt her father. They would argue that hidden cameras and secret recordings violated Dad's privacy and that my evidence collection showed premeditation that undermined my claims of victimization. "They're going to try to make you look like the villain in this story," Prosecutor Walsh warned. "They'll suggest that you manipulated situations to create evidence, that you provoked your father's reactions, and that a truly abused child wouldn't have been capable of such sophisticated documentation." I was prepared for these attacks because I'd anticipated them while collecting evidence. Every recording, every photograph, every written account was time-stamped and corroborated with independent evidence that would make fabrication impossible to claim credibly. The medical records alone told a story of escalating violence that corresponded exactly with my documentation timeline. Hospital visits, prescription medications for anxiety and depression, and photographs of injuries created an objective record that supported every aspect of my testimony. But beyond the legal strategy, I was also preparing emotionally for the confrontation with Dad that would define both our futures. This would be the first time I'd seen him since his arrest, and I knew he would try to use intimidation and manipulation tactics even from the defendant's table. Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who'd been helping me process the trauma and prepare for trial, worked with me on strategies for maintaining my emotional equilibrium while testifying. "Your father spent years convincing you that your perceptions weren't reliable and that your feelings didn't matter," Dr. Williams explained. "During the trial, he's going to try to use those same psychological manipulation tactics to shake your confidence and make you doubt your own testimony." We practiced visualization techniques for staying grounded in truth when Dad inevitably tried to use his charming, concerned father persona to confuse the jury. I rehearsed responses to his attorney's attempts to portray our family as normal and loving, and Dad's abuse as either fictional or justified discipline. The community attention surrounding the trial was intense and sometimes overwhelming. Local media covered every development in the case, and national news outlets picked up the story as an example of how hidden abuse could exist in seemingly respectable families. I did several interviews with reporters who were covering the broader issues of domestic violence recognition and the challenges abuse victims face when their abusers are respected community figures. People need to understand that abusers often choose professions and community roles that give them credibility and authority, I told one reporter. My father used his position as a respected educator to shield himself from accountability and make it harder for people to believe that he was capable of violence. The interviews were emotionally difficult, but important for raising awareness about the sophisticated ways abusers maintain their public image while committing crimes in private. I wanted other victims to see that even powerful, well-respected perpetrators could be held accountable when there was sufficient evidence. As the trial date approached, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation about finally confronting Dad in a setting where his charm and manipulation tactics wouldn't protect him from consequences. For the first time in my life, I would be able to speak my truth without fear of retaliation, knowing that the evidence I'd collected would support every word I said. The 3 years I'd spent documenting Dad's crimes had prepared me for this moment when justice would finally be served and the truth would be exposed for everyone to see. The trial of Michael Williams began on a gray Monday morning in October, with the courthouse packed beyond capacity. Media trucks lined the street, survivors' advocates held support signs, and community members who'd followed the case filled every available seat in the gallery. I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, wearing a navy blue suit that made me look older and more confident than my 19 years. Beside me sat Detective Morrison and victim advocate Sarah Chin, who would provide support throughout the 3-week trial that would determine Dad's fate and define my future. When Dad entered the courtroom in his orange jail jumpsuit and shackles, I was shocked by how much he'd changed during his months in custody. The confident, intimidating man who'd terrorized our household had been replaced by someone who looked defeated and desperate, his carefully maintained facade cracked beyond repair. But even in chains, Dad tried to use his old manipulation tactics. He looked directly at me with what he probably thought was a loving, concerned father expression, as if he could still convince me that our family's destruction was somehow my fault rather than the natural consequence of his own crimes. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh opened the trial with a statement that laid out the case in devastating detail. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a case about a man who used his position as a respected educator and father to hide years of systematic violence, psychological torture, and sexual abuse against his own daughter. Walsh walked the jury through my evidence chronologically, starting with Dad's early verbal abuse and escalating to the attempted strangulation and death threats that had finally prompted my contact with law enforcement. She played audio recordings of Dad's most violent outbursts, showed photographs of my injuries, and presented medical records that documented the physical and psychological trauma I'd endured. But the most powerful evidence was the video footage from my hidden cameras. The jury watched in stunned silence as Dad choked me against the kitchen wall while screaming threats, threw me down the basement stairs, and discussed with Mom how to break my spirit more effectively. The defendant didn't just abuse his daughter, Walsh told the jury. He planned and strategized about how to maximize her psychological suffering while maintaining his respectable public image. This wasn't a parent losing his temper. This was a predator systematically destroying a child's sense of safety and self-worth. Dad's defense attorney, Robert Kim, attempted to portray his client as a dedicated father who'd been unfairly demonized by a manipulative teenager seeking attention and revenge. Kim argued that I'd provoked Dad's reactions through disrespectful behavior and that my evidence collection showed premeditation that undermined my claims of victimization. Amanda Williams spent 3 years secretly recording private family moments, violating her father's privacy and manipulating situations to create evidence, Kim argued. A truly abused child wouldn't have the emotional capacity or technical sophistication to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. But this defense strategy backfired when Walsh began presenting the evidence systematically. The medical records, police reports, and witness testimonies created an objective timeline that proved the abuse was real, escalating, and entirely initiated by Dad, regardless of my behavior or responses. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from medical professionals who'd treated my injuries, school counselors who'd noticed changes in my behavior and academic performance, and law enforcement experts who explained how my evidence collection methods were actually typical of intelligent abuse victims seeking protection.
Dr.
Patricia Williams, the forensic psychologist who'd evaluated both Dad and me, testified about the psychological dynamics of family abuse and the sophisticated ways abusers maintain control over their victims. Mr. Williams exhibits classic characteristics of a narcissistic abuser who views family members as possessions to be controlled rather than people to be loved, Dr. Williams testified. His daughter's evidence collection shows remarkable resilience and intelligence in the face of systematic psychological torture designed to destroy her sense of reality. But the most devastating testimony came from the other victims who'd come forward after Dad's arrest. 3 former students testified about inappropriate touching, threatening behavior, and sexual assault that had occurred in Dad's office during after-school meetings. Jennifer Martinez, now a college sophomore, testified about Dad forcing her to perform sexual acts in exchange for better grades and threatening to destroy her academic future if she reported his behavior. Mr. Williams told me that no one would believe a troubled student over a respected principal, Martinez testified. He said he could make sure I never got into college if I caused problems for him. I was 17 and terrified, so I did what he demanded and kept silent for 2 years. Similar testimonies from other victims revealed that Dad's abusive behavior extended far beyond our household and had been enabled by his position of authority and community respect. The pattern of violence, manipulation, and sexual predation painted a picture of someone who was truly dangerous to any vulnerable person in his orbit. When I took the stand to testify, facing Dad directly for the first time since his arrest, I felt a mixture of terror and empowerment that I'd never experienced before. This was my opportunity to speak truth about years of abuse, while protected by law enforcement and supported by undeniable evidence. My father used his reputation and my mother's enabling to convince me that the abuse was normal and that no one would believe me if I reported it. I testified, looking directly at the jury rather than at Dad. He told me repeatedly that I was crazy, oversensitive, and mentally unstable. He said that respectable families like ours didn't have domestic violence problems. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through specific incidents of abuse while video and audio evidence played on courtroom monitors. The impact on the jury was visible. Several members were crying as they watched footage of Dad choking me and heard recordings of his most violent threats. Dad's cross-examination of my testimony was brief and ineffective. His attorney couldn't challenge the objective evidence I'd collected, and his attempts to portray me as vindictive or manipulative were undermined by the obvious trauma and sincerity in my voice. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Mom took the stand as a prosecution witness, fulfilling her obligation under the plea agreement to testify truthfully about Dad's abuse and her own enabling behavior. Mom looked devastated as she entered the courtroom, wearing prison clothing and shackles. The months of incarceration and psychological counseling had forced her to confront the reality of what she'd enabled, and the guilt was written across her face in ways that makeup couldn't hide. "Mrs. Williams," Prosecutor Walsh began, "I want you to tell the jury about your knowledge of your husband's violence toward your daughter Amanda." Mom's testimony was heartbreaking in its honesty about her own failures. She described specific incidents where she'd witnessed Dad's abuse and chosen to ignore it, explained how they'd worked together to gaslight me and cover up his crimes, and acknowledged that her enabling behavior had put my life in danger. "I saw Michael strangle Amanda in our kitchen, and I did nothing to stop it," Mom testified through tears. "I heard him threaten to kill her, and I told myself he was just venting frustration. I saw bruises on her body, and I accepted his explanations instead of protecting my child." The most damaging part of Mom's testimony was when she described their private conversations about strategies for controlling me and preventing me from seeking help. "We talked about ways to isolate Amanda from potential sources of support," Mom admitted. "Michael said we needed to convince her that she was the problem in our family, that her perceptions weren't reliable, and that no one outside our household would believe or care about her complaints." Mom's complete breakdown on the witness stand was devastating to watch, but crucial for the jury's understanding of how systematic family abuse operates. Her testimony showed that Dad's crimes weren't impulsive acts of anger, but calculated strategies for maintaining psychological control over me. During cross-examination, Dad's attorney tried to portray Mom as another victim of Dad's manipulation, but her own recorded words planning my psychological abuse made that argument impossible to sustain. The trial concluded with closing arguments that summarized 3 weeks of overwhelming evidence against Dad. Prosecutor Walsh's final statement was a powerful indictment of both Dad's crimes and the institutional failures that had allowed them to continue. Michael Williams used every advantage he possessed, his education, his community standing, his position of authority, and his wife's complicity, to systematically torture a child while maintaining a facade of respectability, Walsh told the jury. Amanda Williams survived not because anyone protected her, but because she was strong enough and smart enough to protect herself by documenting crimes that demand accountability. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 14 felony charges. As the verdicts were read, Dad showed no emotion except anger, glaring at me as if I were responsible for his conviction rather than simply the survivor of his crimes. Judge Margaret Chin sentenced Dad to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crimes some of the most systematic and calculated family violence the court had ever seen. Mr. Williams, you used every advantage in your life to hurt people who trusted you, Judge Chin said during sentencing. You betrayed your daughter, your students, your community, and your profession. You have forfeited any right to freedom or consideration for rehabilitation. But the moment that provided the most satisfaction was when Judge Chin addressed Dad's lack of remorse and his attempts to manipulate the proceedings. Throughout this trial, you have shown no genuine accountability for your crimes and no empathy for the people you've harmed, Judge Chin continued. Your daughter will spend the rest of her life healing from trauma you inflicted, while you will spend the rest of your life in prison reflecting on the choices that brought you here. As Dad was led away in shackles to begin his life sentence, he turned back one final time to look at me with pure hatred. But his anger couldn't diminish the incredible relief and validation I felt knowing that justice had finally been served and he would never again have the opportunity to hurt vulnerable people. 3 years later, I'm thriving in college studying criminal justice and victim advocacy, using my experience to help other survivors navigate the legal system and document evidence of abuse. Mom completed her sentence and continues attending counseling, working slowly to understand how she became complicit in child abuse and trying to rebuild some relationship with me. The case made national headlines as an example of how hidden abuse could exist in respected families and how victims could use technology and determination to build cases against powerful perpetrators. My evidence collection methods became part of law enforcement training programs, and my story inspired other survivors to seek help and document their own situations. So, here's my question for all of you. Have you ever had someone refuse to believe you about abuse or trauma you experienced? How did you find the strength to keep seeking help when the people who should have protected you failed? I'd love to hear your stories and support each other in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about surviving family trauma and finding justice. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with abuse or gaslighting. Sometimes it helps to know that truth will eventually prevail when you have courage and evidence. Thank you for following my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Remember that you deserve to be believed, protected, and supported, and that documentation can be your pathway to justice when other people fail you. Trust your instincts, document everything, and never give up on the truth. Take care of yourselves and remember that healing is possible, justice is achievable, and you are stronger than the people who try to hurt you.